स्वदेशिकस्य शरीरचिन्तनम् भवेदनन्यस्य शिवस्य चिन्तनम् स्वदेशिकस्यैवाचनामकीर्तनम् भवेदनान्यस्य शिवस्य कीर्तनम् यत्पादरेणुकणिका क्वापि संसारवारिधे सेतुबान्धयते नाथं देशिकं समुपास्महे
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
महदज्ञानमुत्सृजेत् तस्मै श्रीदेशिकेन्द्राय नमश्चाभीष्टसिद्धये पादाब्जं सर्वसंसारदावानलविनाशकं ब्रह्मरन्ध्रे श्रीकाम्भोजमध्यस्थं चन्द्रमण्डले अकटादि त्रिरेखाब्जे सहस्रदलमण्डले हंसपार्श्वाद्विकोणे च स्मरेतन्माराध्य.
There's chairs if you like to use chairs, or you can also use these.
सकलभुवन सृष्टि कल्पिता शेषपुष्टि निखिला निगम दृष्टि संपदं
It's broadcasting. We're going to be here. Yeah.
We always broadcast.
अवगुणा परिमाष्टि सत्पदार्थक दृष्टि भवा गुण परमेष्टि मोक्ष मार्गैका दृष्टि सकला भुवन रंग स्थापन स्तंभ
1, 2. Right here. Yeah. Can you hear? 1, 2.
I think it's on.
करुणा रसा वृष्टि तत्वमाला समा सकल समा सृष्टि सच्चिदानंद दृष्टि निर्वासतमयि नित्यं श्री गुरोरुत्रिजा दृष्टि अग्निशुद्धा सम्मान्तता ज्वाला परिचकादिया मंत्रराजमिमं मन्ये आर्निशं पातु मृत्युता तदे जाति तन्नै जाति तद्दूरे तत्समीपके तदन्तरश्च सर्वश्च तदु सर्वशाश्वलायता अजो अमजरोऽहं च अनादि निधन स्वयं अविकारस्यदानन्द अनियान महतो मा अपूर्ववर्णा परम नित्यं स्वयं ज्योतिर्निरामयं विराजं परमाकाशं ध्रुवमानन्दमयम् श्रुति प्रत्यक्षमेति या मनुमानश्चातुष्टयं यशाचात्मतपो वेद देशिकश्च सदा स्मरन् मननं यद्भावकार्यं तद्ददाति मामते साधु त्वं च मया दृष्ट्वा त्वयि तिष्ठति सम्प्रतम् अखण्डमण्डलाकारं व्याप्तं येन चराचरं तत्पदं दर्शितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरुवे नमः सर्वाकृति शिरोरत्ना विराजितपादाम्बुजा वेदान्ताम्बुजसूर्यो यत्तस्मै श्रीगुरुवे नमः यस्य स्मरणमात्रेण ज्ञानमुत्पद्यते स्वयं या एव सर्वसम्प्राप्नोति तस्मै श्रीगुरुवे नमः चैतन्यं शाश्वतं शान्तं व्योमातीतं निरञ्जनं नादबिन्दुकलातीतं स्थावरं जङ्गमं चैव तथा चैव चराचरं व्याप्तं येन जगत्सर्वं तस्मै श्रीगुरुवे नमः ज्ञानशक्तिसमारूढा तत्त्वमालविभूषिता मुक्तिमुक्तिप्रदातया तस्मै श्रीगुरुवे नमः। अनेकजन्मसम्प्राप्त सर्वकर्मविदायिने स्वात्मज्ञानप्रभावेन तस्मै श्रीगुरुवे नमः।
Sure, I've done my time there. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
न गुरोरधिकं सत्त्वं न गुरोरधिकं तपः तत्त्वं ज्ञानात् परं नास्ति तस्मै श्रीगुरुवे
A lot of friends in Cottage Grove, which is closer to Eugene.
मन्नाथ श्री जगन्नाथो मद्गुरो श्री जगद्गुरो ममात्मा सर्वभूतात्मा तस्मै
Definitely, yeah.
ध्यानमूलं गुरोर्मूर्तिः पूजामूलं गुरोर्पदं मंत्रमूलं गुरोर्वाक्यं
Fantastic. Yeah, I'll definitely drop you an email soon.
गुरुरनादिरनन्तश्च गुरु परमदैवतं
It's a beautiful area up there.
गुरो परतरं नास्ति तस्मै श्रीगुरुवे नमः। सप्तसागरपर्यन्त स्नानादिकं फलं
Right, exactly, yeah.
बिन्दु सहस्रांशेन दुर्लभम्
Right. Yeah, it's true. You are.
हरौ रुष्टे गुरुत्राता गुरौ रुष्टेन कश्चन तस्मात् सर्वप्रयत्नेन श्रीगुरुं शरणं व्रजे। गुरुरेव जगत् सर्वं ब्रह्म विष्णु शिवात्मिकं गुरो परतरं नास्ति तस्मात् पूजये।
Then you can move along. Yeah.
ज्ञानं विज्ञानसहितं
Hey, how are
लभ्यते
you?
गुरुभक्तिता गुरो परतरं नास्ति
Wow.
ध्यायोऽसौ गुरुमारी।
Yeah, sometimes I'm very jealous of my friends in Cottage Grove.
यस्मात् परतरं नास्ति नेति नेति वै श्रुतिः मनसा वचसा
Yeah,
चैव
definitely. It's definitely out there.
नित्यमाराधयेत् गुरुम्।
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
गुरो कृपा प्रसादेन ब्रह्म विष्णु सदाशिवा सामर्थ्य प्रभावादौ च कैवल्यं गुरुसेवया।
I live in Philadelphia.
देव किन्नर गन्धर्व पितरो यक्षाचरणगणा मुनयोऽपि न जानन्ति गुरुशुश्रूषणे। माहंकार गर्वेण तपो विद्या बलान्विता संसार कुहरवर्ते घटयन्त्रे यथा घटा। न मुक्ता देव गन्धर्वा पितरो यक्षकिन्नरा ऋषया सर्वसिद्धश्च गुरुसेवात् परामुखाः।
You're from Ashley, and it's pretty cold up there.
ध्यानं शृणु महादेवी सर्वानंद प्रदायकम्।
It's very still.
सर्वसौख्यकरं
It forces you.
We have towels
श्रीमत्
upstairs.
परब्रह्म गुरुं स्मरामि श्रीमत् परब्रह्म गुरुं वदामि श्रीमत् परब्रह्म गुरुं नमामि।
We integrated with everything. Sometimes we still have it back here.
ब्रह्मानन्दं परमसुखदं केवलं ज्ञानमूर्ति द्वन्द्वातीतं गगनसदृशं
We're going to wait about 5 more minutes and then we'll start, okay?
एकं नित्यं विमलमचलं सर्वदी साक्षिभूता भावातीतं त्रिगुणरहितं सद्गुरुं तं नमामि। नित्यं शुद्धं निराभासं निराकारं निरञ्जनं नित्यबोधं चिदानन्दं गुरुं ब्रह्मणा नमाम्यहम्। हृदाम्बुजे कर्णिका मध्य समुच्चे सिंहासने संस्थिता दिव्यमूर्तिं ध्यायेद् गुरुं चन्द्रकला प्रकाशम् पुस्तकाभीष्टवरं दयानम् श्वेताम्बरं श्वेतविलोपपुष्पम् मुक्तिविभूषितं मुदितं द्विनेत्रं वामाङ्कपीशस्थितदिव्यशक्तिं मन्दासितं सान्द्रकर्पानिदानम् आनन्दमानन्दकरं प्रसन्नं ज्ञानस्वरूपं निजबोधरूपं योगीन्द्रबीजं वरोगवैजं श्रीगुरुं नित्यमाम् यस्मिन् दृष्टिस्थितिध्वंसं निग्रहानुग्रहात्मकं सत्यं पञ्चविधं शाश्वतभासतेतं नमाम्यहम् प्रातः शिरसि शुक्लाब्जे द्विनेत्रं द्विभुजं गुरुं वराभययुतं शान्तं स्मरेतं नामपूर्वकम् न गुरोरधिकं न गुरोरधिकं न गुरोरधिकं न गुरोरधिकं शिवशासनता.
Because, usually if you do a day reading, 4 out of 8, but that's so if you don't mind. Yeah, right, exactly.
So, welcome everyone to our little seminar. Before we get started, a few housekeeping things. There's a bathroom on the first floor, bathroom on the third floor. We'll be taking a break after about an hour or so, but you can always go early if necessary. We are recording live. And an old friend has come here today, Tom Garland. And Tom was last year in 2002. And he came from California to set up the video streaming program. And it was quite a adventure, because there wasn't much of that going on at that time. We're trying to invent it a little bit, Thomas. And so he set it up, and we've been doing these online meditations every morning since 2002. And anything takes place here, it's recorded live and archived. And the one thing that I like about this is that everyone feels the field. People report feeling the field of the energy from sitting at home in bed through the internet. And why not, right? So, let's just close our eyes just a little bit. And we'll shift from our wonderful analytic minds. We'll shift from mind. We'll suspend our mind just a tiny little bit and free our awareness rather than being in the mind. It begins to rest in its own self. And the object of awareness becomes its own self. And we'll do this just for a few moments. And then briefly, if you'd like, we can extend this awareness, this energy, the chi, the shakti, various metaphors. We can extend it through our bodies. This field. And then we can extend this awareness to each other. What Yongtang Rinpoche, great Dzogchen master, says is the great compassion. We'll extend to each other without effort to the immediacy of our situation. Then we can rest in this awareness, this field, as we have this little conversation.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk about astrology and fortune telling, as we put in the brochure, somewhat derisively, I think, maybe comes across, and Indian astrology especially. And the reason I say that is it was derisive is because we want to take it out of this kind of concrete, deterministic, predictive light and put it in a different light where it's more archetypal understanding. And also, we're going to talk about it in conversation between myself and my father, Rudy, here. And because I think just even in the dialogue, it puts us more in the field. And that's what we're going to talk about in the light of awareness, meditative awareness. And I think the conversation fosters that versus a lecture. And then hopefully from there we'll also take a look at some charts and examples, and that also kind of brings everybody into, just by having some level of practice, even though this is totally for a general audience. You know, we're not going to get into the mechanisms of Vedic astrology as much as possible. I promise to keep it to a very basic minimum. But that's the idea, is that we want to get to this kind of archetypal level of reasoning, archetypal dimension. You know, when I look at people's charts, it's even that dialogue, you know, is versus this kind of predictive, well, what's going to happen in my future? I'm going to just recite something to you for an hour. If we do it in dialogue, we do it in conversation, this extends the consciousness between me and whoever I'm talking to. And when I do that, I don't even start with a meditation or anything like that, but just that kind of unspoken extension is there. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. When it doesn't happen, not as much arises, you know, or very, very little. And I think I point that out because in Vedic astrology, the saying is that you have to have Jyotish Mati, which means the astrologer does. This is the cultivation of awareness and perception, you know. In the same light, whatever we learn about our own astrological chart, whether it's a lot, you know, and we really study astrology, or it's very little, we just, you know, go in and have a reading, and we have to hold whatever that is, whatever that knowledge is, in the light of awareness, in the depths of our consciousness. And that's where it's transformative. That's where something new arises out of it. You can't simply have it as psychological knowledge, like, oh, I'm a Cancer, I'm emotional because I'm a Cancer, you know, or I'm Mars, I'm Aries, so I'm very independent, and so on. And you can't have it like fear-based, like, this guy just told me my future. It's terrifying, this kind of thing, because it doesn't do much, really, and it's just this kind of concrete thing. Or even the fantasy kind of realm where you say, oh, the astrologer told me everything's going to be great next year, I'm going to make $1 million, and that's great. None of that really does much for the person, predictively right or wrong, something like that. Makes sense?
I'm gonna make more.
Yeah, sure.
I'm gonna jump in at different times and make comments. But
Yeah.
Pete's saying things, and that the Jyotish Mati, where the person reading the charts enters into awareness. Reminds me of a great statement by Bodhidharma made in the 6th century, and he says, beyond words and letters, there's a transmission, and this transmission doesn't belong to any tradition. And it's the very nature of human awareness itself, and that is the Buddha.
You use the word transmission. One thing, as we've leading up to this and just over the years, we've sort of had these conversations. One thing that we're talking about is where I learned Indian astrology was from Chakrapani Ulal, who I met a few people today who are, have, either been students of his or, have seen him a lot. And really, even though, I've been doing this now for 18 years or so, I think, I figured yesterday, what I use, what the actual meat of what I'm talking about, even if it comes from a totally different person, totally different philosophy at times, or, in a different light, culturally it's different, sometimes I'm using the very basic language that he said to me at the, as we're walking around and he's talking about just a specific archetype, because there is this level of transmission that arises, and I try to make that come across with people when I'm talking to them, that kind of trying to draw on that same energy, and I think that comes out of the field in a basic level. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Yeah. So everything has to arise from that. As soon as we get into this kind of empirical understanding here, it becomes this kind of pseudoscience or something like that. And if it's in that level of this transmission, then something very strange and vibrant arises from it, I think. So astrology is not a function of the analytic mind, and rather it understands the energetic field through the language of the field. So in one sense, we're talking about astrology and its transformative qualities when it really arises from the field of awareness. So these are archetypes, the planetary archetypes, and the Sun, Moon, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, these are all archetypal fields. And really in everything I know about astrology, everything I've learned, whether you're talking about the signs, the lunar signs, the divisional charts, the houses, all this stuff colors things, but the planets are the basic archetypal principles of that hold a lot of reality to them, or a lot of meaning and on a very essential level. So what we want to talk about as we go on, I'm going to kind of go through the planets as well. But we want to talk about them as archetypal structures and how we can evoke them through archetypal language, because in a sense, when I say something like Saturn is contraction, or Jupiter is expansion, or Saturn is fear, and it also has these qualities of, it relates to misery or suffering, all these kind of scary things. And these are meanings, or these aren't the essential meanings of it. It's a thing in itself, or a being in itself. And we're using descriptors, or Mars is fire and Mars is energy. Well, no, in a sense, Mars really is Mars, and it has its own essential archetypal beingness, I think. Is that, the way we've been putting it? And so we're trying to evoke them through language. That's when I'm talking about what I'm using Chakrapani's language even. We're trying to evoke them through this something very, to get as close to the thing as possible. Yeah.
What I hear from my side, as Pete says, is, I've talked about this many times, is that these archetypal dimensions are actually of our own awareness.
Yeah.
And they're really not quite outside of awareness. And hey, welcome everybody.
Hey.
And that they are the very qualities of primordial awareness itself that is manifesting in us and in certain type of configurations. Mm-hmm. And part of the challenge for all of us is how to relate to this innermost dimension of our own being. And also, it's also reflected in our circumstances. So in that way, when I think of the archetypical dimension, it's neither simply all within me or outside of me. And one of the things that come up, themes that will be arising, is dualism and non-dualism. So in a certain way, this talk we're doing is actually about dualism and non-dualism. So and sometimes the archetype may seem dualistic. There's this, oh shit, it's Saturn.
Yeah, exactly.
arising in me and all around me at this very moment, okay? And the other side is it, in a certain profound way, as I own that state and own those qualities, I actually become more liberated.
Right. It almost in giving a name to that manifestation of the field, that you almost get back to a more non-conceptual form of it just by interacting with it and giving it a name, understanding the manifestation. And then the transformative thing is when it starts to open up and transcend that specific color of that field or the atmosphere of it, something like that.
Are you saying that in a certain way we go beyond the meaning into a non-conceptual dimension?
To really make to work with the karma of the situation, we have to go beyond the meaning to a non-conceptual space, and we do that through almost the first thing is kind of becoming familiar with the basic archetypal structure, and then through that part of that structure is this or the underlying aspect of it is always this kind of non-duality. And I think that's where the transformative, thing takes place, where we really do metabolize the kind of practical aspects of the karma. Things change outwardly and inwardly, not just simply psychologically, but that's when it's very interesting. You see actual practical events changing even from that kind of non-conceptual.
I think what I hear you saying, I'm in my mind around the planets, okay?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm probably gonna have a lot of hope and despair.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
And mentally, but if I can start to go beyond my mind into the felt sense of of those energies, that could be really something different.
Yeah, it just even in the most basic experience of those energies that arises immediately, I think, or when there really is an experience of, okay, so my Saturn is very active right now, and this is what was sort of an overwhelming thing. All of a sudden, in just the naming of it, there can even be this beginning of that arising, and then you continue to work with it, and you go back and forth, and then, but that's what arises out of it.
Do you think they're felt senses?
Do I think the archetypes are felt senses? Yes, I think that they're very intuitive, understandable forms. Once you kind of work with it, then everything starts to make more and more sense. At first, and one thing I'll say is today, as I go through the planets, as I go through people's charts, at first there is these, they're very paradoxical. There's completely contradictory meanings within a single planetary archetype. There's a good and a bad thing that can happen, for lack of a better word, when we look at it from that kind of predictive light. But there's an underlying language that completely makes sense, or underlying experience of feeling that makes sense on this archetypal level of reasoning, not on a logical level of reasoning, not on an empirical level really, but on its own level. And we pick those up, and I think you have to pick those up by being in something equivalent to meditative awareness, even if you're not sitting down and meditating and so on. One of the interesting things is I think this brings the field of awareness and brings your consciousness back into like action, or into making, practically doing things as opposed to sitting, something like that. This is one method for that. You agree with that? You know what I'm saying?
Are you saying the very circumstances of the arising experience requires action at times?
Yes, that's true too. Yeah, definitely. So, as we discuss this idea of astrology as an archetypal language, and I think it's good to start by what we mean by archetype. And, in a sense, it's a discussion of cosmology, of worldviews, And if we look, we need to kind of investigate our perspective, or the classic, or the new modern perspective in general, versus the ancient perspective of the primal magical perspective in regards to the world, in regards to nature, in regards to meaning and cosmology, versus how we see things now. And this kind of archetypal understanding is in a sense a reconciliation between kind of a more primal animistic thinking and a more modern thinking where the world is more disenchanted, and so one guy who I find very interesting and who I recommend to everybody, if you're interested in this type of thing, is a man named Richard Tarnas, who's a Western astrologer, and he has a book called Cosmos and Psyche that goes into this in a lot of depth. It's very interesting. And so I'm going to read one little thing by him. He says, "The entire human project can be seen as impelling the gradual differentiation between self and world. And as soon as we develop language, we differentiate, objectifying experience in ways that articulate the world's acting on us and vice versa." Okay, and so we go into this. He traces this from Aristotle to the Copernican revolution, the heliocentric model, as being a huge shift in human thought, to where we are now, where we have this very disenchanted cosmos where human subjectivity has meaning, but the world itself is mechanistic, it's objectified, the meaning comes from in here, but there's no meaning out here, this kind of idea. Versus a pre-causal kind of understanding, a primal magic perspective in the world, where everything has meaning. There's no wall between our subjectivity and the world, and there's an interaction on a very intrinsic level, on a very participatory level. Do you follow? You all follow what I'm saying? Yeah. Okay.
Can I comment on
Yeah.
that?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
It feels to me this whole topic of causality starts to
Yeah.
arise as you're talking about this.
Mhm.
Can I play with this?
Go for it. Yeah.
And I think by the early world was animistic,
Mhm.
and it was everything was spirit, inside, outside was spirit, everything was psyche. And then, at least from a prejudice point of view, how I think about this,
I think Buddha came along around the 5th century,
Mhm.
and what he brought was essentially, in a very powerful way, in that time when he was actually alive, was cause and effect. And he began bringing actually rationality and cause and effect into this sea of energy, this big soup of life. And he started having people speaking about cause and effect, thinking about cause and effect in a very direct way that was not spoken before. Everything was simply manifested, sort of happened.
Mhm.
And as he imposed cause and effect, a lot of shifting began to take place in terms of merit and earning merit, and also that spirituality became more and more powerful in terms of cause and effect, what we did, what we didn't do. And you start having an ethic arising around cause and effect, and that what takes place now will have results centuries later. And not only that, but also what started to emerge in that was a very powerful understanding of reincarnation and self-origination, that there was this kind of this movement of this cosmos of simply these events happening out of interdependent origination.
Mhm.
And you started having a sense of order taking place. And since phenomena was felt to be illusionary and not real, much of this emphasis became idealism. It became psyche, and in terms of spirituality and later life, and not so much of this world.
Mhm.
But there was some differentiation is taking place.
Right.
That's okay?
Yeah, I
Okay?
think that the interesting thing too is that we're talking about how we're trying to talk about something kind of juxtaposing what we're talking about now versus that, but at that moment too, it's an enormously liberating thing, even to have that kind of causal relationship, and that's part that goes into it. It's not simply that it was this ethical system or whatever, and it wasn't the fact that everything kind of becomes more and more illusory arises even after from that point, but it goes from this liberating thing to an almost alienating
Force.
nothingness.
Same thing happened 100
Yeah.
years later with Aristotle.
Right.
The world was Heraclitus or Parmenides, presencing all the time around us. Everything's unfolding, and everything is in oneness. And Aristotle comes along and begins primarily teaching cause and effect. And the major focus of Aristotle is on cause and effect, and enunciating primary cause and efficient cause, formal cause. The source of the work is in terms of causality. And for some sort of reason, it feels to me that there's some cosmological game taking place, that in one place, Buddha's doing it, and 100 years later, Aristotle's doing it. And you start having, and for Aristotle, though, the major difference was most of the causes was physical cause. He was primarily interested in physical causality. And you start having a great emphasis on the physical causality of this world.
Right. Definitely. So we get. This is the start of what Tarnas calls this Promethean impulse, okay, and he relates it to astrologically to the actually the transit of Uranus. So you said there's like this cosmic game going, and actually he goes back and he finds these certain the planet Uranus he relates to Prometheus as a mythic on a mythic level, because basically Uranus was named in 1781, so it doesn't have the same mythic relevance to the name, something like that. And I'm not an expert in Western astrology at all, so I actually don't use the outer planets as much, but I'm now starting to become very interested in them. But so even at that level of Aristotle, that's one of the first Uranus transits he looks at, and then from there, this is something that throughout these kind of big shifts in on a very ontological level of progress, or on a level, I guess, more on like this kind of level of the mind changing, the subjectivity, kind of becoming more and more about this of the human self and about individuating, and he takes us to sort of where we are now, where this kind of goes into a corner where the self is this little bubble in a great cosmos that has kind of been completely meaningless, and it's sort of like this. We've finished this project in a sense of total autonomy, but now we have this very alienating shadow with it, and so we can look at astrology even in this light. And in a sense, I'm a very skeptical person, and as I kind of went into astrology, I looked at it in this light at first, where it's similar to a lot of types of psychology, where there is this archetypal level of shared myths, these governing principles of the human psyche, but they're all kind of in the terrain of human subjectivity.
All in our mind.
All in our mind. So it's psychological, and this fits the classic Cartesian model in a lot of ways. Whatever the classic modern model is, meaning is for us. It has this principle of primordial, mythic, numinous characters, but it's all completely relativistic. Now, here's a quote. A lot of this arises from Jung, and at the end of his life, as he worked with synchronicity and then enormously with astrology as well, here's kind of where an interesting way of putting it. The collective unconscious surrounds us on all sides. It's more like an atmosphere in which we live than something that is found in us. Also, it does not by any means behave merely psychologically. In the cases of so-called synchronicity, it proves to be a universal substrate present in the environment rather than a psychological premise. And wherever we come into contact with an archetype, we enter into a relationship with transconscious metaphysical factors. And in a lot of lights, that's somewhat of what we're talking about here, is that the archetypal dimension is not simply psychological. It is more than that, and it's kind of a return, in a sense, to this animistic understanding on one level, where that there is no wall between human subjectivity and subjectivity of a consciousness of the world. That's the idea. You see?
It's like the same field manifesting everything and anything.
We have to look at it in light of field theory, in light of if we look at things as a field, it makes much more sense on a modern, postmodern level, I think. And yes, everything is manifesting in the field, whether it's you and me, or the countries, the way they on a global level, like world events.
Did Jung get to a field frame?
I don't know if he used the word, but I don't exactly see the difference. He got to this frame where the archetypes were entirely essential principles, and that they weren't simply psychological and relativistic at all. He actually did that, and in the end, he's kind of the beginning of archetypal astrology, I think, on a level like that. Well, I don't know if he's the beginning. I don't know my history of Western astrology well enough to say that, because I think that originally that's sort of the fortune-telling, divination. That's what the Oracle of Delphi, this kind of thing. It was almost in the same light. It's not like listening to what objectified gods were saying, but almost kind of giving names to gods, and trying to intuit the meanings from the archetypes. That's sort of what the
like an invocation.
It's completely invocational. I think that's they're not asserting the existence of God and then saying, well, or asserting the existence of planetary interactions, but they're trying to like figure out what these forms are, almost in a manner of like intuiting. So I think that's that's sort of the same thing, really, in the end. One way I was putting this to Rudy before is that to say, the Greek word theos for God, it meant like they would say love is a god versus God is love, and or fear is a god, or wine is a god, that is a god, this is a god. And that's kind of the idea where they're trying to bring this essential intrinsic principle to these feelings, to forms, and this kind of thing. Yeah.
So in a certain way, in this archetypical frame,
Mm-hmm.
divinity is not an entity as such. It sounds like you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I often think of Swami Muktananda, who's one of our root teachers here. And I remember one time a person asking him, he'd always have these live questions and answer things, and people would ask everything. And he says, Swami Muktananda, I don't like God, never seen God, and I really don't like him. And so what do you think about that? And he says, well, who do you like? Well, what do you love? He says, I love my son. I love him so much. And then Baba said, that's God, right there, that love.
So to really, I hope we've made it clear in terms of the archetypal stuff is that, this is pervasive beyond human subjectivity. This is what we're really talking about today. These aren't simply mythic structures of the human psyche, and they're more mythic structures on a cosmological level. And another very interesting.
They're not just stories.
They're not just stories, and even the stories about them that arise that feel like you feel something. I think there's something more essential to them. Just like you can't say, well, I'm going to describe to you this person. He's a doctor and he has shoes on. They're black shoes and he wears a suit every day or something. It doesn't exactly describe the person. So that's sort of when we're describing the planets. Sometimes there's more literary ways to describe people, and then you start to intuit something. But that's sort of what we're talking about when we talk. They're essential principles or something like that. And they're not simply human. I think that they I also don't think that there's a causal relationship. It's much more on a level of, whether you want to call it synchronistic correspondence or something like that. I don't think you can look at it as what we do obviously doesn't change the trajectory of the planets, and what they do doesn't exactly, like, Saturn doesn't move and I go like, it's not that kind of relationship, but there is this strange correspondence that is not causal in that light, but it works on this level of archetypal reasoning. That I think the way, for instance, Jung started to stumble onto this was through his studying synchronicity and looking at little synchronicities and then trying to analyze them as far as the archetypes went. And he started to realize, okay, this whole experience was completely Saturnian. I looked at my watch, someone judged me, all these kind of little, and that's how he started to start thinking around.
You consider like a simultaneous manifestation?
It's a simultaneous manifestation, yes. When you look at it on a level of a field, if you're trying to reason it, that's the way the reason makes the most sense, I think. What do you think about that? Yeah.
I'm just trying to grasp it now that some sort of way, as I'm manifesting in time, hopefully for a long time.
Yeah.
As I'm manifesting in time, there are certain energetic configurations in me that are manifesting me in time, right? Not by causality in that sense, but as I'm actually an expression of the manifestation of that cosmological dimension that we could call archetypical.
Yeah, that sounds because it's I think there's a subtle relationship. It's not simply.
I feel relieved when I think that way.
Yeah.
I feel better.
I mean, I think if you look at something like astrology in this light, it is a relieving thing in a sense, but it's also it's a participatory thing, and that's the key. There's no there's nothing controlling you, and you're interacting on a level with consciousness, and you don't have to look. You can put whatever belief system you want on that. It doesn't really matter. But you're interacting on a level of pure awareness with these ideas, too, and also, if the archetypal field is more than just mind, it's not simply some relativistic thing, then it's not just the depths of the human psyche, but rather the world psyche. Then, in a sense, the underlying structure of the cosmos is kind of pushing us each towards our unfolding spirituality, our own individuation, in a sense, even because it supports that by having these principles there. You kind of interact with them, and it transformation arises, which is a very interesting thing, I think. I wouldn't want to go beyond that to say that I understand it more than that, but there is that relationship. Do you follow what I'm saying? Yeah.
But also here, as we're going along, I'm hearing causality is changing.
Yeah.
Especially how I think about it in terms of Newtonian causality, apples hitting me on the head, gravity, kind of a souped-up ping-pong.
Right.
And I think as we go into contemporary ways of physics and field theory, principles of uncertainty come into all of this.
Yeah.
Principles, understandings of probability.
Right.
And also chaos having organizational components. If
you talk about it in terms of causality, you have to talk about it in terms of a participatory causality, where there's an interaction that is on all those levels, versus simply it's something deterministic, or something even that I do this and something that occurs later. It's not. I don't think it's on the level. And then I think everything we're going to talk about here in terms of the planets and everything is a plurality of meaning and plurality of different ways it manifests. When I talk to people, I say, well, this is the energy of the situation. I can tell you this. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to manifest. I'm going to try to describe these manifestations so that you can... That's when the predictive thing is useful. You try to give someone a prediction, basically, because it evokes the presence of the energy. That's when the prediction is kind of secondary, but it's useful in that light, because it's a...
Say more what you mean by that in terms of understanding the energetic dimension of astrology, that when you're describing possibilities, it actually empowers something empowers the person of action.
So if I say this is the energy where the Saturn or the Sun is in your chart, and this is and I try to use more practical language to what it means. It feels stressful, or it doesn't. It feels liberating, whatever. But the way it manifests, whether the stress is like, say, something where you were sick or you lost your job, these kind of very practical things, or if it just feels like that, nothing's happening, but there's this existential dread. In the sense that energy can be exactly the same. So we don't necessarily know how it manifests all the time. Sometimes I'll see a chart and it will look like this person is really, really under the gun, and you say, well, so what's going on? And there's no specific event, but there's this overwhelming energetic kind of level to it. Other times,
like an atmosphere,
completely like an atmosphere, and other times you think, okay, well, there's going to be a few things, and then there's just this laundry list of like unbelievable occurrences that relate very much on an archetypal level to the planets, and so you never know the actual manifestation, like the quantifiable level, I think, because
quantify the event.
The event, because the event in a sense is secondary to the experience, and even if that may not be true, practically speaking, all the time, if there's certain things that are very practically meaning, just you can't avoid, but at the same time, in terms of healing, in terms of transformation, then the event is secondary to the experience. As you get into on an energetic level, as you get into the energy of the situation, that's where it's transformational. And
what would I be? I'm in the field with you together. We're holding this transitional space together.
Yes.
And your mind is. You're using the field. You're talking through your mind. I'm in my mind somewhere. I'm also in this awareness state. I can feel the presence of it. What does it mean that I have some freedom of invocation. And just what am I invoking?
When you say, I'm not sure I quite...
There's something about invocation you mentioned, even as you talk about the possibility.
Oh, when I'm invoking what the planet is?
Yes,
Yeah.
and that gives me as the hearer
Yeah.
something that can take place. I'm not just a passive hearer like a cow. You know?
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think that if something is evoked that on this kind of level of archetypal understanding, whether you know what, doesn't matter if you know what Saturn or Jupiter or whatever means, but if there's an evocation of that energy, then that, in a sense, metabolizes the experience. I think that's where the beginning of that is. You know, where it becomes familiar, and it's almost like you're giving a name to something, that your own practical experience or your own, whatever it is.
I think what I hear you say that if I move my will, I don't mean my mental will, but the more subtle will.
The agency, the core agency, kind of, yeah.
My core agency, which actually is my essence as a person.
Mm-hmm.
If I move agency into however these energies are being indicated, and I can have some felt sense of that, something is going to
That's what
something
something.
what the yogis call sankalpa begins to take place.
Yes.
That feels okay.
That feels that, just knowing those basic dynamics and patterns of meaning makes that arise.
Death.
Definitely even death. And I think that one of the more useful things that I've, in my experience, has been talking to people who are dying or really, really difficult things. A lot of transformation arises in even talking about the planetary interactions that are occurring there. I think that because there's a big there's many on an archetypal level. There's a lot of meanings that do kind of relate to death and to or just transformation through going through really intense suffering, and things of that nature. And it's useful for people to say, well, this is this is supposed to be for realization as opposed to for God knows what, this kind of thing. Yeah. So
as you're talking right now, I'm starting to think about the multidimensionality of the planets and the multidimensionality of our life. And one level, here we are sitting in this room, and there's Lorette, and it's flesh and cars and events. This event, very singular events. And the other level of the language of astrology, or the other archetype, is kind of the underbelly of this, if you wish.
Mm-hmm.
And then another level, it's just pure potentiality, just this pure, people call it the Dharmakaya or Shiva, and that some sort of way, the languaging can touch these different realms. Entirely.
So maybe we should talk about about the planets. I don't have we done about an hour? Or shall we do? We'll just do that before we break. I think. Yeah. Okay. So because I think that you can get all those different levels, where there is this manifesting atmosphere in the field, and then through each planet, there's also this relationship with kind of non-conceptual openness as well through each archetype. So I'm going to talk.
Just pause there.
Yeah.
Non-conceptual openness. Can you say a little bit more about that? Here?
Definitely. I think that when you look at it from, like, you read an astrology book or you talk to an astrologer and they say, okay, here's the higher level and the lower level of the planet. So it manifests, because it's going to manifest on all different levels of existence. Okay. And so, for instance, Mars, like the lower level is anger and conflict and violence or something like that. And I'll talk about this as I go along, but always the highest form of, whether it's a minor planet or a major planet, is in some level some kind of liberation or some kind of openness to this kind of non-conceptual. It's beyond the color of the planet, really. I think when its light is as open as it can be, the planet, something like that.
So in a sense, all the planets are light.
And all the planets are doorways to liberation, in a sense. And some are more obvious than others, and some are more like they hit you over the head, and so they say, okay, this is a really important planet, this is a lesser planet. But, you know, there's...
I like the Venus doorway.
The Venus doorway is a very nice doorway, yeah. That's the one, if you could choose your door, choose that one, or choose Jupiter. Don't choose, you know... yeah. But most, you know, but it's also... It resonate. Our birth charts resonate with us because, you know, I mean, this is kind of a goofy metaphor, but those doorways are open in different ways to each of us, and you know, some things are more obvious to one person than to other people, and you know, one person's an intellectual, and they really are Mercury, and so you know, in a lot of spiritual situations, the intellect is not just, you know, it's just the mind or whatever, but Mercury is more than the mind. It's the, you know, you process the mind with it, but Mercury is also, you know, real discrimination, real truth on a level of it relates to the intellect, but it's like the highest level of the intellect, and that in itself, it's a discernment. Yeah, exactly, and that in itself is a doorway. So I'm going to kind of go through and talk about the planets as they are, because really, and some of them they really may not resonate at first, because there is things that are kind of incongruous about them, you know, and as you get into the reasoning, as you talk about it, and as you learn about it in your own life, then it starts to make more sense. So I'm going to try to make it make sense from the start, but there's on some level there's you know, and they're present on any scale. I think I said that, but you know, we can talk about the events of the world, the economy, wars, the president, you know, whatever, this kind of thing. We can also talk about our relationship, our work, our cat, and our dog. You know, anything. All this stuff arises in these same archetypes. So the sun, let's start with that. On a level that's often hidden in Indian astrology, and I would think probably in the West too, I'm not as familiar, the sun is really a symbol of the self or the soul. On however you want to describe that, the most basic being, this kind of idea. It's light. But we don't always recognize it as much when I'm talking to people. I think that the moon or the rising sign, it's more immediately relevant, because the sun is the self in that non-conceptual level, in a very colorless way almost. Like, so when you have this experience of the sun in that light, it arises mysteriously. It arises sometimes cataclysmically in people's lives, but it doesn't. It's not this immediate recognition for some reason. I find that fascinating. It's hidden, but because you can, even if it's not hidden, you know, in your own experience. As I'm talking to people, it's hidden because there's so little color to it or something. It really is just openness and light, you know.
So it's not my finger, it's not my
well, it's not, there's nothing emotional to it, there's nothing expansive or contractive to it, so there's not a lot of narrative to it in the same level as there is, until there suddenly is, and there's a mysterious opening to it. Because really what the sun is on the opening level is how the world perceives you, and this is much more relational. Okay, you know, it's your ego, your persona, your pride, your charisma. Sun also relates a lot to self-confidence. So how you put yourself out to the world. A lot of people will recognize that if you say, you know, your sun, because of where it's placed, there's trouble expressing yourself or wanting to, you know, put yourself out there, or you really express yourself quite well, and you know, you talk a lot, you know, you act a lot, you know, whatever it is, you know, people will recognize about that about themselves more because it's very much of the world. But and on you know, it's a symbol of the father on you know, on the main symbol of the father. We'll see some of it in Jupiter as well, but sun is really the symbol of the father. So those things are very recognizable. But what's most interesting about it is it's this light and being on a very ontological level. So it's kind of this return to origin or something like that. That's in a sense is quite mysterious.
But here from the Dzogchen point of view, is that the sun
is actually primordial awareness manifesting, which is the light, primordial awareness, openness, light, and it's manifesting actually as my own subjectivity in the here and now,
yes,
at a certain profound level,
right, uh-huh.
And which actually can undo dualism in a very direct and easy manner.
Yeah,
That's a-
definitely, yeah. And I also, I don't exactly know how to put this, and you may figure out a better way, but I also think, as much as in the East, you hear about this dissolution of ego and destruction of self to get to nothingness. It's coming from the same archetype, that sense of self and charisma and so forth. And one thing I've noticed is that the very spiritual experience of the sun often arises in finding that light and integrating it into the ego, into the very present consciousness, into the world, because that's almost like when people describe something as a leap of faith or something. There's this unity, kind of non-duality in a sense that's created not by the dissolution of ego or everything, but everything kind of going into the world.
When I understand it the way you and I are talking about the sun right now, and sun is primordial awareness manifesting in this singularity of my own awareness, and then influencing my mind, which is really good to have one. I couldn't be sitting here right now, big amoeba. I think actually in a profound way it validates appearance and the divinity of appearance and the actuality of appearance having value. You with me?
Yeah.
And that this world does exist, and I'm glad it does.
Right. It does exist, and it's of this world. That the integration. I mean, there's plenty of methods to touch on that light, but I think that the integration is what I find. It's exciting when you see that in people's charts, or when it happens to you, or something. So the moon. Okay, so if the Western astrology, as far as I understand, is very solar based. In the Vedic system, the sun, the moon, the rising sign even are kind of given equal weight as the general significators of personality and self. So there's a stronger lunar component to it, I would say. And the essence of the moon is really perception. It's also where we start. Often that's where I find people have the most recognition, because it's how they take in the world. Okay, it's the moon is the container of our consciousness. And so you describe someone to their moon, usually this is something that they recognize. On a lower level, the moon is all the affects, the emotions, the fantasies. When moons are very well placed, those again, there's this integration of emotion and direct perception. I think where people experience things through feelings that are more than just like, oh, this is just feelings, like external feelings, but there's a real emotional.
Feeling actually becomes a mode of perception.
Feeling can become it can either be a hindrance to this perception of the moon when the moon is like, for instance, really overly agitated by Mars or something like that. Then that you have these times where you can't. Then it's emotional in the sense that I can't see the forest for the trees. Emotions in that sense, confusion, right? And it can be very extreme versions of this. On the other end, the emotions when the moon is moon is exalted in Taurus. Okay, so that's a sign of Venus and a sign. There's a very emotional quality to that moon, but that doesn't. And you may even describe the moon in Taurus people. You say, well, this person is very emotional at points, but that emotion also integrates with the perception, the world manifesting in that person, taking in the world, I think. So it's interesting.
I'm thinking again, often we're talking in terms of Xochitl and Vajrayana, and also Shaivism. So in a certain way, in certain forms, in Eastern thought, emotions are considered poisonous, like bad. And so dissociation is your route, which has its own problems. But actually, from this point of view, when you're holding it in the moon of the perception, and you're practicing that, then emotions themselves becomes vehicle of deepening the experience of what's happening now.
They become that's what the container of consciousness. This idea, I think, is very useful. So one way that Chakraprani described it, we were talking about, it was called there's all sorts of different yogas, and Kimadruma yoga, which is like the cataclysmic moon yoga, meaning there's really not much to be done at all. And it's very rare. So what it means is there is no container. So if we look at the moon as a glass of water, it's either you can have a very full moon, the moon is full, it's very unhindered by anything negative. You can contain all this consciousness. Or if you have a little bit of water in it, you still have a little bit of water. You can work with that. But if you have the Kimadruma yoga, then the container is shattered. This is the idea. So it's an interesting metaphor to look. I think as water in a cup, the moon kind of relates to that. So it really is represents the integration of one's mind into the field.
It's also the cup. Also, it's also the container.
The moon is the container of consciousness.
Like
so
vase.
Yeah, exactly. That exactly like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's one way of looking at it. Yeah.
Can you see where the again from this frame of yoga, the meditation is really useful there?
Yes, especially in light of the moon. Yeah, and you'll also notice that meditation is really useful in people who are going through stuff with the moon. That's because it grounds their experience. So a lot of the main transit of Vedic astrology is the Saturn transiting your moon, and meditative awareness plays a big role in that, in kind of reining in the Saturn. But the reason it does that is because it's through that moon. It's through being able to contain more, to understand more, to hold more of this experience, I think.
Does Saturn actually strengthen the container?
Yeah, it's a transformational thing that leads to progress. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Is the kind of underlying current there.
So meditation actually builds the container of awareness by meditating. In a certain way, the moon gets stronger, or my relationship to that.
The more self-awareness you have, and say, for instance, in the Sati Saturn, the more you're able to hold the experience of Saturn and make it transformational, as opposed to allowing it to be insufferable. If you don't have that awareness, if you don't have self-awareness, you end up sort of a pawn to the whole thing, and this gives you agency. And so really, but it all comes from a level of, as we talked about earlier, agency, but not simply will, like I'm going to do this and I'm going to deal with it, but on a core agency level that rises from the field. I mean, that's what I would say.
It's interesting. Pete talks about agency for some bizarre reason. I remember reading about the Council of Trent in 325, and I have a lot of spare time on my hands.
Guess so.
And they were preoccupied. What does a person mean, right? What's a person? Because they were trying to figure 3 gods or 3 persons and 1 god. Mm-hmm. But they came up exactly with that word self-agency, which at that time it didn't make much sense. Mm-hmm. But as we move into this deeper, self-agency really is powerful. The second thing, from having gone through Sati Saturn,
yeah,
it also seems that if you can hold it through meditation, that then in a certain weird way, Saturn itself becomes the base of your awareness.
Yeah. And I think we can talk about that more when we get to Saturn, but it really is the archetype at its essence, or as much as we can talk about its essence, is self-realization. It's not simply it's not the cause of some sort of thing that occurs that starts, but it's actually the archetype of realization itself too. It's not simply just the hammer you use to drive in the nail or something like that. So
it is actually the archetype of the realization.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's not because it's useful to language it as, okay, I'm going through this because Saturn is causing something, but it's also the resolution in a sense, because what it brings is, one form it brings is like discipline is one way of looking at it, or like a groundingness. It's a ground,
It is the method and the result at the same time.
Exactly, right. And
it's cool.
Yeah. So going through the Mercury, so we talked about the moon is how we take in this world, okay? And we talked a little bit about the Mercury before, but the Mercury is how we process it. It refines, it expresses what we've perceived on it's communication, it's language itself, our faculty to determine truth, real from unreal, something like that. It's the intellect in a lot of senses. It's also the nervous system on like a level of Ayurvedic medicine and in astrology. So you see a lot of nervous disorders come from Mercury interacting with in negative ways.
Is it energy also? Is that
It's definitely an energy. I mean, it's the energy of language, you know, and again and as we talked about how they were all different doorways to liberation, it's real discrimination at its highest, or discernment, as you called it, you know. So it's the intellect kind of integrating in the field at its highest level, you know, or wisdom on a level of you know, analytic thought. I guess that may not be the way to describe it.
Is it like the mind?
It is the mind.
Feeling, sensation, memory? Or?
In a general sense, you know, when we look at someone's chart, when we look at the Mercury, it's the mind, it's the processing of the mind. If the moon is the perception of the mind, the Mercury then takes that stuff and processes it.
Okay.
And so one thing, when you have the moon and Mercury in the same house, it's like they're very close together. That causes brilliance, and it causes too much proximity. You know, and then so like the process and the perception is too close together, something like that. So you said someone with a wild imagination, who's, or sometimes you get someone who's really brilliant. You know, there's a lot of other factors going into it, and who's able to have that clarity despite the proximity of the processor and the, you know, and what's bringing it in. Sometimes you get someone who's, you know, completely fantasy based. It sort of depends on what they ground that action in, you know, that but it brings stuff like that, you know. But it really it is a doorway in the sense that as language is, you know, it everything arises out of that kind of communicatory aspect of Mercury.
So in a certain way, language itself helps hold a sense of being in some kind of way.
I mean, I think so. I think language is incredibly important. I mean, you know, outside of astrology, I mean, you know, but you know, it depends how you. You know, it's expression on an artistic level too, and I think both Venus and Mercury relate very much to artistic expression principles. That, you know, it depends how you value those, I guess. But I would value them quite highly as very reasonable methods towards and archetypes towards experiencing what's non-conceptual beyond that. Yeah. Does that make sense to you, what I'm saying? Yeah.
One thing I'm thinking as you're talking, I'm thinking, you know, people always, what's realization? And I'm thinking realization, we make it a spiritual thing, and here I am. But I think really that's not a good word, spiritualness. I think realization is really realizing these energies in my life, just as I am.
I mean, I think that's entirely. I think you don't have to be. I really try to, you know, as we're talking here, we're talking as this group, but you don't have to have it. It doesn't have to be a spiritual component. It's a very useful way to do it, but there's, you know, an artistic light, or, you know, whatever stuff. But one thing interesting is, you know, if we think about this as Indian astrology too, it's like it kind of goes back to, well, you can be a householder Hindu, or you can be an ascetic, or you can be whatever, and that may have had a different meaning, but there's that undercurrent of like, well, you're living your life according to your archetypal structure. You're doing what you know, and that in itself is sort of the same idea. You don't have to be a saint to you know, because we're kind of going beyond. You just have to be kind of interacting with the energies in the most authentic way you can. You know, something like that. Yeah.
What does authenticity mean in this frame?
In this frame? Okay, yeah.
Coming up
Yeah.
to some level, authenticity.
Well, that's a good question. I want to look at a chart later that I think relates to that.
Okay.
But the authenticity of your experience is, I guess, in one sense, one way of using that word is if it's participating with the archetypes on a level of. It doesn't mean you have to know astrology. It's not like the only, but you're participating with this force on a level of a conscious level, or on a level that's really integrated. I think that's authentic versus because if cause, so for instance with Saturn, like say sometimes, so it's like Saturn you can kind of run from. Yeah. You can just kind of be like and most people go through life like, if you're scared of like financial stuff, if maybe that's the form it takes. It's like I'm not going to open the mail, or and like I don't like opening the mail. That's why I bring that up. I think, look at all that mail. I'm never going to open that mail. So and my wife's like, you have to open the mail, and this has gone on for 20 years. I just won't open the mail, and I know what that is. I'm the astrologer. I see exactly. It's the Saturn, but I'm not opening the mail. So she opens the mail, and hopefully that changes, and I get over it, and I know better, and but I'm not participating with that. Okay, and I'm not authentic to my experience because of that, and that's too bad. But that's a silly way of looking at it. But that's the truth of the matter, and so a lot of times we're going to look at Saturn because it spells things out in a very clear light. But I think that maybe that hints at what I'm talking about. Whereas if you put that agency into it, and this means and a lot of people, it's also in your charts. Do you have a certain amount of agency? But it's also not in your charts, and that's one thing that most astrologers overlook. And I think it ends up being a little bit egotistical to say, okay, you're not going to do this, and or you're going to do this, and you don't know that.
They actually don't know that.
You don't know that, and when you say that, you leave the as we talked about at the beginning, the Jyotish Mati, which is where you're holding the potential space. You leave, as you say, as you give this a judgment like that. There is predictive elements to everything when you're talking, because that's someone's giving you money to hear their future in a sense, because that's what an astrologer has been set up to do culturally or something like that. But you can only do judgment out of that. You want it to be as potential.
As you mentioned Jyotish Mati, in this thing, Jyotish Mati is not just the light looking into a situation. Mm-hmm. It really is the great compassion. And the great compassion is not empathizing with pain and internalizing it in your own body, so you have two miserable people. Mm-hmm. But at the more profound level, you're experiencing the potentiality in everything and everyone. Huh? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the Jyotish Mati is actually the sense of potentiality. Mm-hmm. And at times to have someone recognize that sense of potentiality in that mirroring, almost like the neuron mirroring, it actually helps activate that.
Definitely, yeah.
Third comment, just in what we've been talking about the past few minutes in terms of this whole thing of participation and going for it. In the Shaivite tradition, one of the final sutras is like basic faith is undamo bharavaha. In other words, going for it is it.
So you mentioned compassion, so I want to talk about Jupiter next, because I think the essence of Jupiter on one level is expansion, and it's grace and creativity. It's knowledge, the unfolding of knowledge and wisdom. Ultimately, this wisdom leads to compassion, and I mean that in the sense this is the real highest aspect of Jupiter is compassion. So Jupiter is the easygoing planet; it's expansion, and that's when we look at it in a chart. It's the expansive principle. It's good to have Jupiter. It's easy. It's a good planet to have well placed, because it protects you and it helps you and stuff. But it also opens up to compassion, compassion for this world, for compassion for other people, and a spiritual compassion. So one interesting thing is the classic Jupiter retrograde thing, which means when Jupiter's retrograde, you see this very clearly, because it creates over the course of life 3 different kind of motivations. One is like this spiritual bliss, spiritual happiness, religious happiness, whatever it is. Another is a lot of frustration with spirituality, with religion, and it will come on a level often of polemical or political level. Mm-hmm. And you kind of fluctuate between these. Mm-hmm. And the third is openness, a change to like charity or compassion as a spiritual practice, and it's often the one of the ways that manifests is it's like a charitable like orientation and like a that
generosity.
generosity, well, devoting yourself to other people. Like a selflessness, but as a spiritual practice, and so that's where we see from Jupiter retrograde. I thought it was just an interesting way of putting it to show that. But does that make some sense? So that's the Jupiter. The Venus is the other.
Jupiter. Why do they call Jupiter the guru planet? You could help with that.
Jupiter, because Jupiter is wisdom on a level of guru, and so Jupiter is in a sense the guru principle. Okay, and if you have Jupiter in the first house, the guru is you resonate with the guru as yourself. That idea. If you have guru in the fifth house, which is a really wonderful place, then it resonates with children, and you have this interaction on a very playful level because the fifth house is children, and there's a playfulness to that wisdom, which is already inherent in Jupiter. If you have it in the seventh house, it relates to relationships, but the guru principle is not simply, it brings good teachers. Jupiter brings good teachers. A well-placed Jupiter, it makes one a good teacher, and it makes one interact on that level. And so on a higher level, those teachers really do become something like a guru. And you have rough Jupiter, you have rough gurus, this kind of thing. But it can arise from the self too.
Does it reveal the very self? Is it a self?
I mean, I think it is. I think that as that kind of relationship can be, I think it definitely would reveal. It's this most expansive planet, and there's enormous. Especially in terms of like devotional qualities. I think that's when you have a Jupiter that, if that's the nature of that Jupiter. Say, for instance, in the 12th house, which deals with liberation, those people would be very devotional. That's one way that manifests. Devotional to whatever it is. It's kind of...
Do they live in a life of devotion?
They live a life, it's that kind of blissed out...
What's dangerous about Jupiter? I can see the negative a lot, but Jupiter...
So Jupiter's easygoing. That's the problem, is it doesn't let you... Sometimes if you're really into the Jupiter, it's very gregarious. It has addictive qualities. Yeah, well, it is. It's like, if you have a very strong Jupiter, it's like the big like laughing Buddha. There can be diabetic issues is a big one, but also addiction, like drugs, alcohol, sort of thing, or just anything like life just gets, and not on a level of addiction, which also comes from the eclipse energy, where there's like on an edge, of the experience, and like there's a shadow, but more like a God, I just love booze, just like, and that's how it starts, and then that becomes a real problem, and especially that sort of thing. I think that's the way of putting it.
You touch eclipses, which I never understand, but
Right.
I'm always afraid of.
Yeah.
Could you describe
Well,
that edge of eclipse? What that is? So we're running a little ahead. What does
yeah.
eclipse?
Well, we can talk about when I say the eclipse energy, I'm talking about the nodes of the moon, which is
The nodes being
what's called Rahu and Ketu, which in the Indian system they're the points where the Earth's orbit and the Moon's orbit can intersect during an eclipse, like the celestial equator, and they're considered as powerful energetic points. They're like shadow planets. All right, and so because as we were saying earlier, Uranus was found in 1781, and Pluto and Neptune were found even after that. We don't use the outer planets in the Indian system. But what's absolutely fascinating is that Rahu and Ketu interact in this their archetypal meanings, or their essence is incredibly close to the kind of the three outer planets, in a very strange way.
Pick that up?
They pick at this. I mean, I find it very fascinating. Yeah, and I mean you can use them both because there's differences of calculation or something like that. But like you can look at both and they'll be in different places, and then both of those archetypes will rise in different places. But they're so they're this idea of eclipse energy. They cause repercussions throughout the field. They're in a sense wherever Rahu and Ketu are, it's sort of like they cause an eclipse to that whatever they're interacting with.
With the house that they're in?
With the house, but so if the moon is with Rahu or something like that, they very much affect what they're interacting with, and not always in a positive or a negative light. the Rahu, the north node, is like it's a pair of opposites. It's on one level it's a very toxic planet. They're both kind of like very value neutral planets. They're demonic in the Greek sense. They bring up all sorts of subtle chaos. This is the kind of idea. So Rahu, the north node, is much more in the world. It's much more like the collective trends. Like you can follow people with really strong Rahus are often very famous because they really enter into the world in a almost occult way. It's like, and then there's an occult aspect to this. And say for instance, the moon in Rahu or the moon in Ketu brings psychic capacity. That's one way of putting it. Another way is that the moon, which is this container, is overwhelmed by the stimulus of Rahu. The openness. It creates an openness to like otherworldliness, to the uncanny. This kind of idea. And so Rahu can be a very, very tough planet. It can also be a very healing planet when people use a lot of the stuff they've gone through with Rahu. It suddenly becomes this purifying planet. And Ketu, the south node, so is sort of the opposite of this. So if Rahu is in the world, Ketu is withdrawal, and it's solitude, and it's isolation. And it's also really extremely subtle knowing, direct perception. And Ketu has this psychic energy, and it's esoteric, but really what it is, beyond everything, is pure unboundedness.
What does that mean?
I mean that it's like you're breaking... There's always this kind of force of kind of taking you out of the world, in a sense. It's a very ascetic form of liberation, I would say. And it's like a razor's edge to kind of experience it.
But it's not simply contraction.
No. Saturn is much more contraction. Ketu is like oblivion in a sense because it's it's very like void, like immediate. There's a lot of surprise. Mm-hmm. There's not as much stress like contraction, but it's like there's surprise and chaos, and it's immediate. And then there's a sort of isolation to it.
You mentioned a little bit more about healers, and over the years we've had many healers come here, of all sorts and all kinds of yogis, and and sometimes how it works out, we're able to see their charts, and their charts are always interesting because it's not just pi, but they're most of them have very, very, very difficult configurations, and
right.
And that's always mysterious in how they become what they are.
A lot of, the eclipse energy brings up, especially interacting with other planets, brings up a lot of very momentous, interesting people who do not have easy lives. Like, people have to come from places where they've gone through a lot of really hard... Rahu brings a vindictive element to charts. It can bring abuse, it can bring a lot of things like that. So can Ketu, but it brings Rahu's also addiction, and it's got a kind of a cultish level to it. Bad gurus, bad teachers, But then a lot arises from it. A lot of real mystery arises from it, and kind of uncanny.
And how does that take place?
Because it creates sensitivity with the rest of the chart. So everything is more sensitive when those things are very strong. So if the moon and Rahu are together, if you can kind of ground that in the safer part of into the field on a level of like taking care of yourself and so on, then you're in a very sensitive, open mind, or the ability to perceive things.
More perceptual.
But I mean, there's things I don't understand. But you see this. I'm not like I don't know what to make of psychic phenomena and stuff. But I've talked to people where sometimes, you say, okay, you're going to go into the Rahu cycle right here, and it's that day, and there's all this strange psychic phenomena, and then you see another thing, and there's another strange. So there is occult manifestations to it that are very interesting. I just don't, I don't know what to make of it in terms of, I like to be open to it, but not say, well, this is this. Yeah. But they interact almost directly with the outer planets in very interesting ways. Like Neptune and Ketu are very similar. They both relate to liberation in a very transcendent but withdrawing, still aspect. I always like Ketu is ascetic in the sense that you can either be, I'm sure I've told a lot of people here, but when the Ketu is strong, but it's like you're either in the room like a patient in a mental asylum, or you're like a ascetic in a cave meditating, and you're doing the same thing. You're stuck in the room. No one's gonna let you out. but that's the deal. But that in itself, K2 can really be liberation, and Neptune's sort of the same way. It's very undifferentiated. It's very unbounded. And
is it like openness itself?
It's like openness itself, but it has the coloring of. You got to openness by kind of going through very chaotic. It's randomness almost. Like, it's like the experience of openness within randomness. Yeah. Or chaos. There's complete unpredictability. Yeah. Yeah. But it's very like high, interesting level thing when you meet people who are like really in that. It's just a hard walk, I think. Or something like that. And Uranus is the other side of that. And also Pluto kind of goes into both because Pluto is very destructive. The way, at least, what I know about Western astrology, Pluto has this kind of elemental creative destructiveness to it, which I think we relate in the East more to Saturn as well, because I think we give Saturn more, perhaps, like, properties of realization than the Western astrology does. I'm not really sure, but that's the sense. And Uranus really relates to Rahu in terms of it being this principle of change, rebellion, freedom, liberation.
What is that?
Uranus, okay, which is really Prometheus, according to Tarnas. That's actually the kind of mythic impulse it relies on.
So it's like that's what's bringing the light in a particular time?
It brings revolutionary change, which you see with Rahu as well. And it brings, especially on a more personal level, Rahu.
Do you have any examples of that? I'm just curious.
The Uranus thing was really interesting, which is it's discovered even at the culmination of the Enlightenment and the start of the French Revolution and the American Revolution, and then he traces it from there to like subsequent revolutions, the Russian Revolution. There's another big Uranus transit, and it goes on from there. But it has this quality to it of like the kind of trickster kind of archetype, and that's sort of similar to Rahu. It is exactly as Rahu is. Yeah. So lastly, I guess we didn't mention Venus, but Venus is as it is in the West, as is Mars. Venus is love in its many forms, the unfolding of love. Okay, Venus is harmony, it's art, aesthetics, it's eros. This kind of idea. And Mars on the other side of that is life force. It's fire, and I think Mars is an interesting one because you see a lot in terms of yoga. You see the control of the fire. Like a lot of people, Hatha yoga, physical yoga, are very big Mars people, and they're taking kind of conscious, working in the awareness of that physical energy, the life force, making it self-sustaining versus self-immolating. That's where a lot of that.
Say it again, please.
So the fire of Mars is either burns you up or it becomes sustaining, and it adds more and more. If you're putting it towards something that is realizing, or it makes progress in some fashion, whatever that means to you. So on a lower level, it's violence, it's out of control, and it burns. On a higher level, it can really be this life force. It can be independence. It is will. And so if you make it sustaining, it's no longer burning you as the fuel, but you're putting it into, it revitalizes itself. And that's, I think, what you notice that is like if you're a yoga teacher, the 10th house of career is like Mars. It's like or it's in the first house is a self. And but that's that energy.
Do you see Mars as a symbol of the Kundalini, or do you think they're not related?
I think that there's this relationship, but Kundalini is strange because it also is so much like Rahu, and it's also because it's this snake.
It is a snake.
And then Rahu is so much that energy too, where it's a very electric, eccentric energy that's not simply good or bad, and so that it has those qualities of the nodes, or both nodes, the Rahu and Ketu, and then also of Mars, and then so it's all those, but there's also there's an overlap between those archetypes where Mars and Rahu as well. I think
so Mars and Rahu,
there's a relationship, there's a vibrational overlap, and there's also when they get together, there's an over. So it's not I do think there's definitely a relationship because it is a basic life force, archetype of this basic fire, and there's also overlap between Mars and the Sun because they're both fire. And, so it's.
Do you think a lot in terms of the elements, like the water element, air element? And could you just talk a little about planets and how
I think especially in relationship to fire, because that's, I understand judging like sensitivity or strength based on the elements, but the fire element is what I feel like arises most when you're talking to people, because that's what is most perceptible. Maybe that's what it is. Yeah, or maybe there's other ways of describing something that's watery or earthy without saying that resonates more.
Would Venus be water or earth?
I mean, it's all sort of changeable things depending on where it is and everything. I just think that the fire is when you talk about Mars, you have to talk about fire, and that's where that on an elemental level to me is the most important because that arises in almost every chart. Because Mars is so Saturn is time, but Mars relates to how our action relates to time, and on a level of this fire being self-sustaining, you can then suddenly act in time. You can act in phase, and you can put yourself forward. But if you're not, it's like if you're acting out of time, out of phase, out of how you need to act, not on a moral or ethical level, but on a level of situation or experience, burning you up. This is the kind of, and we see this more. You see this all the time. Like Mars is like a hard planet to get under control, and then it adds enormous practical value to people's life to say you have to do this at this time. That's why when we get into that's where predictive stuff kind of arises, because the timing, a lot to do with Mars, I think, a lot to do with Saturn.
In the Deutsche tradition, I should say.
The most fundamental thing is that we can experience this timeless awareness, and to have that access to that gives a person a lot of freedom to be able to touch timeless awareness. Is that articulated any place in astrology, the phenomena of timeless awareness?
Timeless awareness.
That timeless state.
The timeless state. I mean, I think it's articulated as the undercurrent of all those. I mean, no more so than the rest of life, or no less so. I don't know. I don't know exactly.
It's like basic underlying the whole story, or
like the primordial timeless. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the undercurrent. We're talking about that the archetypes manifesting from that and of that,
okay,
and then using them as a method of kind of.
So it's not given as any particular archetype.
It's not, but that's not that's the underlying structure of the arc. Okay. Of the dimension, I would think. I mean, I think that when you talk about time, and this is the last planet we'll talk about, and we'll take a short little break here, but is Saturn. Saturn is time in many senses, because it's it's contraction and it's
decay.
Decay, yeah, and it's death, and it's length, so people with strong Saturns have a lot of longevity, and it's like you just can't bring them down. They can't go if they want to go, so it's like, and not that that's the case. I mean, a lot of people really have a lot of, it's a long life, but it brings longevity, and it brings discipline, and it brings struggle, and you have to struggle to get what you never feel like potential is quite reached when the Saturn is incredibly strong, but that's actually pushing you farther than your potential. So one thing with Saturn is often you don't feel like you've reached your potential, and whatever atmosphere, whatever part of life that resides, but it really pushes you to reach that potential in that feeling. I think something like that. That's one manifestation of it. But really, what Saturn is realization through facing reality, and it's whatever you go through, it's there to lead you to some new transformations. Whatever's left undone, you have to go through to get to the next place, for lack of a better word. And
in that way, it's karma.
It is karma. It's the most direction where we see karma, in this light, And it's where karma arises. It's the organizer of karma, It arises in a very direct way, And
So wherever that's in your chart, that's where a lot of the karmic drama is going down.
it is. And whenever the Saturn transits, if we look at it, it's interesting because it changes signs every 2.5 years, which is a very organizing length of time in a sense too for people versus the moon. The more inner planets go by a lot faster. The Mars and the Mercury and Venus. I mean, Saturn's transit is so important because it sort of mimics our sort of transformations, and it really pushes us in directions. As it goes into that house of our children know it. As it goes into our house of relationships, our relationship knows it.
It's true that
Some I've heard that Saturn destroys the house. I don't know if I buy that. Saturn, the house it's in is destroyed.
Okay,
That sounds like an overstatement to me.
It depends. I've noticed that when planets are in the 4th house, which is the house of home, which is, in most of the textbooks and stuff, it's like, the home, the real estate, also the childhood home. But what it really is like the spiritual ground, the base of your experience. When Saturn is there, the base of experience is a battle to hold. To find a new experience, it is destroyed. A lot of things happen. When planets are in 4th house in general, you really have to go into that and deal with something. When Rahu's in the 4th house, a lot of really tough stuff can come up with your childhood home. But then you need to create a new experience for yourself, a new base of experience. When Saturn's in 4th, a lot of stuff. It can have the destruction of the house, for lack of a better word. It's a language to explain something, where then something new has to arise for that person to feel fulfilled. Yeah. But I mean, it's not always the case. No, I mean, I think that Saturn in the 9th house. 9th house is wisdom. Saturn brings wisdom in the 9th house. It brings maybe the most important kind of wisdom, the wisdom of really facing reality, and seeing things as it is, and that can be enormously useful. So, no, I don't think that's the case totally. Yeah, but and we'll try to look at this more today because I think it's nice to learn a little bit in light of Saturn, because hopefully it's quite obvious.
So we're going to focus on Saturn on the chart?
Well, no, we're going to focus on a couple different charts just to take a look at the basic, and the more questions people have and so forth, we can do that. But should we take a little break and then?
Yep. 15 minutes or 20 minutes. There's refreshments upstairs, and see you guys in a little bit.
What time is it?
We went to 12.
2012. Okay, great. Yeah, perfect.
You're late.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna. Good. Everything's good. Excellent. Yeah, I do too. Yeah, I think it's great. Yeah. Stretch my legs out. Hi.
Hey, hi.
How are you? Doing good? Is it? Okay, great. Sure, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Did you tell your mom hello?
Really working exceptionally well. The rhythm was good. You know what?
Exactly. Yeah. 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 The end result is a little like, okay. Yeah. 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 I hope so. I like what he says to me. When I learn from him, I learn so much. But I definitely think there's a difference of philosophy in terms of the underlying, like, what you want people to get out of it. Yeah.
And then the interview lines up when I don't know what the when, but
How are you, Pete? Nice to see you again.
not my. When are you?
Sure. So I've been coming down like every 3 weeks or so. So I can, if you leave me like your email or something, I can email you, or and they send out emails about it too. But we can also do it on the phone, which is sooner. Person, sure, yeah. Oh, she does. Okay. Okay, gotcha. Yeah, well, yeah. Why don't I get your email or something, and then or phone. And if you don't hear from me and you see, that'd be great. Yeah, sure. It's Peter Bauer, 51@gmail.com. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. Excellent. I hope it's been useful today. Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. I've been stressing about accessibility.
We're gonna turn the computer off just for a second. Those of you guys who are online, and we'll come back on in about 10 or 15 minutes. So do not worry, but come back in about 15 minutes. But we're going to turn it off right now. We don't want to just have all this recorded. Bye.
The thing is, I'm expecting that.
Wow, great. Congratulations.
So I thought, that's Saturn, right? So